Hello once again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our next installment of our World History Lecture Series. Today we're going to look at the Assyrian Empire and the Phoenician Empire, two very different models of empire in the ancient Near East, and one being a land-based multi-ethnic empire, another being a maritime or naval empire that really ended up serving as more of a loose collection of closely allied city-states around the Mediterranean region. So the first we'll look at is the Assyrian Empire from about 911 to 612 BCE. The Assyrians were, of course, not the first major Mesopotamian empire. Preceding them in the Tigris and the Euphrates river valleys were the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians. There were a number of empires. But for the purposes of this course, we have to have a reasonable starting place to cover the material, so we begin with the Assyrians, as they were probably the first really multi-ethnic empire. And by multi-ethnic, we mean that there's more than just Mesopotamians in this empire. There's more than just these folks from what is modern-day Iraq. But there are other cultures that will eventually fall under Assyrian dominion, largely because they will aggressively use their army to conquer many of the other surrounding peoples in the Middle East, and those included not only the heartland in Mesopotamia, but also what is modern-day Syria, the Levant, which is the coastline of the ancient Middle East, in modern-day Lebanon and Israel, as well as Egypt. So just to sort of give you not the best look, but the Levant region is right down in here, the southeastern corner of this particular map. All right, so that coastal area there. These conquests brought the Assyrians control of the major Asian trade routes, the western end of those trade routes. So trade routes that were already starting to be developed, that were coming from as far away as India or China. They're very early, but the Assyrians then were able to control sort of the western terminus, okay, the western point of them, and as a result could control the movement of goods now into the Mediterranean world. So that was really quite important. Of course, they would have rivals for the trade routes on sea, because the Assyrians never really developed a very powerful navy. That would be the Phoenicians who would go and do that. So really, they confined their trade to the valuable resources, including iron and silver, and it was very much overland trade, not naval or maritime trade. Okay. One of the strengths of the Assyrians was their highly centralized monarchy. So instead of having local rulers who sort of governed in their own way and kept the peace locally, especially, let's say the Assyrians conquered Egypt. The Assyrians aren't really interested in letting Egyptian governors govern Egypt. They really want to ensure that an Assyrian governor is going to be in place, an Assyrian ruling class in Egypt, to keep the peace there. So it's much more tightly controlled by the Assyrian king and his advisors. So local, autonomous, regional government is not really in the Assyrian playbook. To that end, all resources, everything was really considered to be the king's private possession, and all servants were considered his, all subjects, all people, all citizens were considered his servants. Okay. The number of tools that were used by the monarchy, they used propaganda, so that there would be inscriptions on major buildings, stelae, which are these sort of stone monuments that would be set up in different areas to remind everyone who was in charge. We saw that even earlier in Babylonian history, one of the predecessors to the Assyrian kingdom. The Babylonians, King Hammurabi, set up his law codes on these large black obsidian stones, so that everyone knew what the law was. in this case, the Assyrians would make sure everyone knew who was in charge, who the big conqueror was, and that they would never forget it. And oftentimes, they are depicted in the process of conquering, or in some cases, hunting. So, for instance, the title slide that we were looking at, this is Ashurbanipal on his chariot with his bows, hunting lions, okay, from a major scene of Assyrian art. Okay. Also, and in contrast to the ancient Egyptians, the Assyrian king was not a god. The Assyrian king was instead the chief religious official. He was kind of the chief priest of the people. He was always consulting the god Ashur in major decisions. But again, whereas the Egyptian pharaoh is considered to be the reincarnation of a god, that is not the case here in Assyria. Okay, but there's a very close relationship, and as a result, the king basically governs through both his advisors, through his military, through his government, but also through a hierarchy that of religious leadership. So as people come to worship their gods, they have to go essentially through the king ultimately to have access to their god. So all aspects of life really are gonna focus around the person of the Assyrian king. The weapon of choice was not for Assyrians was not diplomacy, was not tact, was not good government. It was sheer military power. And they were probably one of the greatest military forces of their day. And they were an Iron Age people, which gave them tremendous technological advantage over their enemies. So they were highly organized, technologically advanced. They developed a trained group of very experienced soldiers who were always there, who were always training, who were always preparing for war, were always responding to military challenges when they arose. And then if a major campaign against a major enemy was necessary, they would add to that with other recruits who would be called up at different times. But this core of experienced soldiers were really some of the best fighters in the ancient world in the time period that we're studying. As I mentioned before, they used iron weapons, and also because they were starting to control such vast territories, stretching from the Persian Gulf all the way down to the Nile River Delta, they needed to be able to rapidly respond to crises as they emerged. And so therefore, like a lot of Middle Eastern armies, cavalry becomes very important. The Assyrians make good use of cavalry. The Persian Empire, the core of their military will be cavalry. And as we saw in that carving a moment ago, that is the mounted archer, which was really the key, that you could combine speed and the ability to lob missiles, to throw arrows. So you could cover a lot of area and have a wide range of control with mounted cavalry archers. So that was another important innovation. They were also very good at besieging heavily fortified cities, using a range of weapons, tunnels underneath walls, towers to top them, or battering rams to bash them down. There were many fortified cities in this time, and fortification techniques had really advanced very significantly since the earliest days of urban dwelling. Okay. The governance, again, was usually as violent as the conquest. Right? So in governing their empire, the Assyrians ruled with a mixture of tribute and terror. Tribute, money that they could extract from the locals, okay, essentially taxes. And that meant that, they didn't necessarily have to conquer a region. They could just say, hey, we're here, our army is here, and if you don't give us money, we're going to kill you all, and we're going to destroy your city to make an example of you. So the rest of your people decide to go along with us. And so this is called exacting tribute. It's kind of the way the mafia works. It's protection money. You give us money, we basically leave you alone. We'll come back for money later on. If anybody attacks you, of course, you are now a tributary of our empire. We're going to come and defend you. But also terror. And that was essentially the threat of military force. If you rise up in rebellion against us, we will make a show. We will destroy one of your cities. We will capture the soldiers in your army. We will crucify them. We will hang the corpses of your dead soldiers to line the roads that lead in and out of what once used to be your city, so that everyone in your civilization will know that you don't mess with us. And that was their means of execution. That was not developed by the Romans. Crucifixion was initially developed by the Assyrians. In some cases, they would simply take whole populations, split them up, and deport them to different regions. Spread them out. They have a region that's kind of underpopulated on the borders of their empire, that there's all kinds of attacks that come through there. They just plop people down there, say, here, build a fort, defend yourself. If you get massacred, all well, you're kind of on your own. Or stop rebelling against us, depend on us, and we'll come out and we'll protect you. It's a way of using what was a rebellious threat to their advantage. Okay? As a result, a lot of people were mixed in different areas. There was a lot of ethnic mixing because the Syrians were moving different ethnic groups around and putting them into relationship with other groups that they would not have otherwise encountered. Subject people, people that the Assyrian government, the Assyrian army had conquered, would often serve, in some cases, like slaves or servants, building roads and infrastructure, farms. Okay, as I said a moment ago, developing less populated parts, less developed parts of the empire. And when a government is so highly centralized like this, it tends to be erratic, if not consistent. If the king isn't interested in governing, then the government's going to fall apart, or it's going to become very lax, right? That's what happens when you have a highly centralized government. You have to have kings who are really interested in governing in order for it to work. But if you don't, then people can get away with all sorts of stuff. This erratic government relied very much on oaths of allegiance that were taken by subject rulers. So the Assyrian king goes and conquers, let's say the king of Israel, okay, the northern kingdom of Israel. In that case, the Israelite people were simply deported, and the government was eradicated. When they conquer Egypt, then they're going to make the Egyptian rulers swear an oath of allegiance to the Assyrians. Okay? And if these oaths were broken, the army would be sent in, and taxes and tributes and all sorts of nastier things would be levied against the rebellious population. Now, we'll turn finally to their economic and social order. Much of the Assyrian economy was based on exploiting its resources in land and workers. Right? You conquer people, you make them work the land, you forced labor, and extracting raw materials. Iron ore is going to become really important because that's the technology that feeds the Assyrian army. So resources are critical. It's also a very agricultural, land-based agricultural society. So taxes are going to be collected based upon the productivity of the land. That's how the Assyrians make their money. We'll see that that's very different from the way the Phoenicians make their money, which will be through profit on trading different commodities. Here, it's really the land tax that's going to be so important to providing the Assyrian government with the money that it needs. There were essentially three distinct classes in this agricultural society: those who were free and owned land, okay, so free farmers. There were farmers and artisans. We've encountered that word already, but artisans were people who made stuff: pottery, weapons makers, metalsmiths, things of that nature. Farmers and artisans who served rich landowners and the king. So they were in service, They were not free. They did not own their own land, but they also were not slaves. Okay. They had a degree of, this middle class had a degree of movement and freedom, whereas the slaves did not. Okay. And slaves largely came from the conquered people of the Assyrian Empire. As we said before, there is a limited amount of trade throughout the empire, but it still is worth talking about. It was based on urban production of pottery, tools, clothing, and there were some luxury items. And this is where the Assyrian Empire is an important bridge between the luxury goods that are coming from as far away as China and India, of dyes, important gems from the Indian Ocean region, ivory, and metals. So the Assyrians serve as kind of a communicator or transporter of those luxury goods coming from the Far East and Mesopotamia to the Eastern Mediterranean coast. And finally, this, as I said a moment ago, this intensive agricultural base that really is what defines their economy, is what allowed for tremendous food surpluses that supported the army and the government bureaucracy. Okay? So really, again, the Assyrian land-based military army empire and its tax collection apparatus, collecting taxes from local farmers, basing its wealth on agricultural output, is really what is the glue that binds the Assyrian state together for as long as it lasted, which wasn't terribly long. It is eventually overcome by the late 600s, by around 612 BCE. All right, that's all we have to say for the Assyrians. Stay tuned for our next installment, which will be the Phoenicians. Thanks very much.